Today I'm going to be talking about the embodied carbon policy in Vancouver. So most of the other panelists are going to be talking about operational carbon emissions and passive house. I'm talking about the other half of the equation, which is embodied carbon. And so that refers to the emissions associated with construction materials. So think of all the concrete, steel, glass, insulation, all those materials that go into the building. We basically quantify the carbon emissions across all the different life cycle stages. So from cradle to grave, everything from resource extraction, transportation, manufacturing, construction, operation, all the way to end of life. Now, here's a kind of a representation over a typical lifespan of a building. So let's say it lasts 60 years. These yellow bars represent the operational carbon emissions to heat and cool and operate the building each year. And that's historically what we use energy modeling and things like PHBP to quantify those emissions during the design phase. And an analogy to that is a life cycle assessment for quantifying embodied carbon. So embodied carbon refers to, all the emissions from the construction materials, right? So upfront, before the building is in operation, there's a big pulse of embodied carbon emissions. But also, if there's certain building components that need to be replaced or maintained throughout the lifespan, we also account for that, as well as any emissions at end of life. And so you really need both pieces of this to get a holistic. Now, historically, the thinking has been that operational carbon emissions are far more significant than embodied carbon. So maybe we don't even need to look at it. Maybe embodied carbon is so small, maybe it's 10, 20% of the whole life carbon emissions. So maybe it's we can ignore it. But what we're seeing is that as we design buildings that are more and more energy efficient, that we're designing towards passive house levels, and also we decarbonize our electricity grid, the operational carbon emissions decreases over time. And specifically in the BC context, that's definitely where we're at, where we're getting so low on the operational carbon emissions that the embodied carbon can become a much bigger slice of a smaller pie. So let's throw some metrics here. Robin was mentioning about the BC Energy Step Code, which mainly focuses on the energy related aspects. But there was a study done by Integral Group a couple of years ago that was looking at the greenhouse gas intensity limits. So each year, to operate the different buildings at different steps along the BC Energy Step Code. You can see as you get higher in the steps, you get lower emissions. But also there's big differences in the source. So like, is it from electric heat pump, electric resistance, which are all below, let's say like 1 to 2 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year. And that's very, very low, right? Whereas like the gas or hybrid systems may be in the 4 to 13 range. And also, we have the Building Benchmark BC report that recently got released. So we have the first year where we've quantified and actually measured greenhouse gas intensity emissions for many of the, I think 500 plus buildings, or I think it's 700 plus buildings in BC. And the multi-unit residential building average is around 21, office is around 15. So it gives you a sense of like, this is what a typical building is maybe, and then this is what step code might bring it down to. That gives you a frame of reference for how to compare that to embodied carbon. So these are two different benchmarks. On the left-hand side, this is the Carbon Leadership Forum. A couple of years ago, they did, back in 2017, they compiled over 1,000 life cycle assessment studies, whole buildings, from around the world. And you can see there's a big range, anywhere from below 100 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared up to 1,000 or even higher, with many of them in the 2 to 600 range. Similarly, One Click LCA, which is a software provider in Europe, they've also got almost 1,000 buildings in their benchmark set, and they've created this letter grade rating system. So for different building types, if it's below 200, that's considered quite good. If it's above 800, that's really high. So that gives you a kind of a rough order of magnitude. So if we pull these two pieces together, this is a current project that I'm working on, so these are just preliminary results. But as an example, for the baseline building for this building, 5-story office building, is around 558 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. And if you compare that to different operational metrics over 60 years of operation, if you have the measured GHGI numbers that I showed you earlier, then embodied is about 40%, 60% for the operation. But if you actually look at the actual building that we're working on right now, based on the energy modeling results, which is an electric building, we've gotten the operational emissions so low that it's 1.1 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So you can see then the embodied carbon becomes 90% of the total emissions. So it dominates. So that's kind of the background context for why Vancouver is looking at embodied emissions, because it's quite significant. Now, back in 2017, they had the rezoning requirement, green building policy for rezonings, which accounts for about half of the new construction in the city. And they have various different compliance pathways. And most of the pathways actually require you to quantify and disclose the LCA results for your building at the rezoning stage, and then updating it at building permit, and then finally at occupancy. So at this stage, they weren't requiring any reductions, they just want disclosure. Interestingly enough, actually one of the pathways that doesn't require you to quantify embodied carbon was the passive house pathway. So that's just a little quirk, but for some of these other certifications, they may be optional or they're required for quantifying, but most of the projects did require this. And that helped build up a lot of industry capacity in the city. And I think that's a crucial piece. Now, fast forward a bit, back in 2019, the city declared a climate emergency. And so they created the Climate Emergency Action Plan, whereby the city of Vancouver is targeting a 50% reduction by 2030. How do they get there? It involves 6 big moves, and one of them is focused on embodied carbon. And that big move number 5 is states that by 2030, the embodied emissions in new buildings and construction projects will be reduced by 40% compared to a 2018 baseline. And this, to my knowledge, is probably the most ambitious embodied carbon policy in North America. And it's probably right up there relative to the rest of the world. So this is what the rollout of the plan looks like right now. In this year, they're going to update the rezoning requirement. So they're likely going to require at least a 10% reduction in embodied carbon. They haven't disclosed the results for that yet, or what the requirement will be, but it'll be at least 10%. And the general strategy is to have the rezoning requirement lead the building code by about 5 years. So do the ambitious stuff on the rezoning side. So for example, we're going to go at least 10% on the rezoning this year. And then in 2025, they'll update the rezoning requirement, probably bring it more in line with the 40% target. But also at that point, they'll also then have the building code adopt the previous 2021 rezoning requirement. So if we say like if it's 10 or 15% this round, in 2025, that'll kind of filter through to the rest of the code. And then by 2030, they'll bring it all in line and the rezoning will be pushed up even above 40%. So that's kind of a high level overview of like where the plan's going. And just the overarching strategy for embodied carbon really focuses on changing the rules, changing the culture, the market, and the context. So the rules, that's basically what I was just speaking about right there. Having a performance requirement, requiring projects to do whole building LCAs and demonstrate a certain percentage reduction relative to a baseline. And they're also looking at how to support, change the culture. And that involves, for example, how do we support other organizations, support events and knowledge sharing networks, such as CLF Vancouver and others like ZEBEX, and also like funding tools and training, advocating with other organizations and other governments to also address embodied carbon, and also having an increased focus and attention towards supporting marginalized people in the building industry, including women and Indigenous and racialized people, and among others. They're also going to look at how to change the market. So, for example, making it easier to build with mass timber, removing barriers to that, and also making it less expensive, potentially integrating it with existing incentive programs, and also looking at where there's potential to look at complementary strategies that the city is also focusing on outside of the embodied carbon domain. So, for example, can we address the zoning requirements that reduce the underground parking, which reduces the amount of concrete in our parking structures? So that's kind of a high-level overview of Vancouver's approach to embodied carbon. I just want to throw in one last note, is that I see a lot of policy work happening in the US right now on embodied carbon, and much of it focuses on the individual material level. So these Buy Clean policies like Buy Clean California or Washington, looking at environmental product declarations of individual materials and regulating at that level. I would also really advocate for putting in policies at the asset level. So like at a whole building level, doing, looking across all the materials in a building, not just like specific to concrete or steel or whatnot. And that's it for me.